Just quickly, what the Joint Terrorism Task Force is, in case folks don't know. It was created in 1980. Although its formal purpose is to prevent terrorist activities, it has a troubling history of civil rights abuses and operates under a veil of secrecy. And the standard way that the JTTF collaborates with local law enforcement is to have local law enforcement officers deputized as JTTF agents, and then they operate under the JTTF. So way back in 2000, the ACLU and CopWatch and several other organizations became aware of the fact that Portland was participating in the JTTF, and that decision had been made without community input or oversight. And so we were extremely concerned and immediately started advocating for withdrawal. Then 9/11 happened, and we were very concerned about potential civil rights abuses and started, and surveillance of First Amendment activities and profiling. And we were unfortunately correct that really got stepped up by the FBI. So we continued our advocacy, and as part of that, in 2004, we actually started a campaign to access public records about the JTTF using the Freedom of Information Act. And what that campaign revealed was that the JTTF was indeed spying on many political advocacy organizations. So following that research in 2005, the Portland City Council finally heard our concerns and withdrew from formally participating in the JTTF. So fast forward 5 years, and then in 2010, the FBI manufactured a terrorist threat in Portland, which many of you may remember was the Christmas tree bomber incident. And when that happened, there was fear in the community, and rejoining the JTTF again became a subject of debate. So in 2011, the next year, when it officially came before City Council, we of course opposed rejoining, but it became clear that City Council was intending to enter into a sort of quasi-relationship with the JTTF where they would collaborate on a case-by-case basis. So understanding that that was going to happen, we tried to build in some sideboards. So there were a variety of safeguards that were put into the agreement. One of those was that there was a requirement that the Portland Police Bureau report and the JTTF report to City Council each year on the activities of the JTTF and on how the civil liberties of people in Portland were either being protected or not. And unfortunately, in 2012, in 2013 and 2014, that reporting was just grossly inadequate and was not enough to really tell the public or City Council what was actually going on. In that range also, Mayor Hales actually officially requested security clearance as the police commissioner so that he could engage in oversight, and that request was denied as it had been to Mayor Sam Adams before him. And then in 2015, sort of inexplicably, at least inexplicably to me, Portland fully rejoined the JTTF and removed all of the safeguards. Even though those safeguards we know were not really being followed, they then just threw them out the window. And that is where we are today. So this last year, many of the organizations that had been working on this since way back in 2000 decided to renew our campaign to get back out of the JTTF.
I think this is an important step. You know, I sort of feel like we're where we were during the Civil Rights era, only the opposite, right? In the Civil Rights era, you had states that weren't complying with the law, weren't protecting the civil rights of their citizens, so you had the federal government come in to force them to comply with the law. And here we have the federal government not obeying the law, and I think it's up to the state governments and local governments to enforce the law to make sure that the federal government is obeying. I'm happy to come to Portland because Portland has been a leader, as Kimberly suggested, in 2005 being the first city to pull out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force for civil liberties reasons. I think really put Portland on the map. And even before that, you might remember shortly after 9/11, Attorney General John Ashcroft had ordered the FBI and requested the assistance of a lot of state and local law enforcement to interview thousands of Muslim immigrants. And Portland was one of the cities that stood up and said, no, we're not going to participate that's just crass ethnic profiling, and we won't participate. So I was happy to come here in 2011 to testify before the Portland City Council, and happy to testify tomorrow. My experience with the Joint Terrorism Task Force started in 1992 when I was on one. I had been working at the FBI for 4 years doing white-collar crime. Anybody remember Charles Keating and the Lincoln Savings? I worked on that case for 4 years with about a dozen other agents and a big task force. And a friend of mine, I was looking to do something new after 4 years on one case. And he said, well, how would you like, you have blonde hair and blue eyes, you can be a Nazi for me. And so I went undercover in neo-Nazi groups in Southern California, and that was my first experience with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And we had rules that we conducted those investigations under called the Attorney General Guidelines. And the Attorney General Guidelines were an outgrowth of the Church Committee that the Senate put together after J. Edgar Hoover died to look at what the FBI and the other intelligence agencies were doing. And what they found was in the area of national security, basically the FBI was playing without a rule book. They felt that they could do whatever was necessary to, in their mind, protect national security, however they defined national security. And typically how they defined it was that if you were doing something that was challenging the economic, political, or social status quo, you were a potential threat to their security. So they would take all kinds of measures they called disruption activities to try to actually prevent you from exercising your First Amendment rights. So Congress, after that report came out from the Church Committee, started to write legislation that would limit the FBI's power. The FBI didn't like that, the Justice Department didn't like that. So Attorney General Edward Levy wrote guidelines where he said, Congress, you don't have to write the rules, I'll write the rules. And he wrote a set of guidelines that were actually pretty effective. And basically what they suggested was the FBI had to have a reasonable indication that a person was committing a crime or likely to commit a crime in order to investigate them. Not a very high standard, right? FBI agents, like other law enforcement agents, tend to be pretty suspicious of people right out of the bat. So it's not hard to convince somebody with a little bit of evidence that there is a reasonable indication that somebody might commit a crime in the future, right? It's very low standard. But I found once I was working with that standard that it was very good not just to protect the civil rights of the innocent, but to actually make sure that I was using my resources in a responsible manner. And you know, as I got used to using them, the discipline of having to take out a sheet of paper and write down all the things, all the reasons why I felt person A deserved to be investigated versus person B, I could determine which one I should investigate, right? It was pretty simple. And especially working undercover with neo-Nazis where everybody was saying something that scared me, that sounded dangerous, that sounded horrible. Having that discipline of actually writing out, wait, you know, what evidence do I have against this person versus that person helped me focus my investigation on people who were actually going to do harm rather than people who were just saying things or looked scary to me, right? I mean, we're all human and we're afraid of different things, so I found that discipline very good. And then after 9/11, immediately the FBI started challenging that issue, right? So almost right after 9/11, within a month, they passed the USA Patriot Act in Congress, and what the Patriot Act actually did was amend a lot of the laws that applied to the FBI to reduce the standard of suspicion necessary to start gathering lots of information. right? So you had the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was something that was also a product of the Church Committee investigation that forced the government, the FBI, to go to a secret court to get a warrant whenever they wanted to spy on somebody for national security purposes. But what happened was the Patriot Act reduced the standards, right? So before it used to be when an agent went to the FISA court, they had to certify that the reason for them to use this secret court was that the primary purpose was to gather foreign intelligence rather than criminal evidence. So there's basically two systems, right? There's the criminal justice system we all know from Perry Mason, and that system is far from perfect, right? We know that that the government uses those powers inappropriately at times, sometimes charges people excessively, uses evidence that they obtained through some specious manner. But at least there's some oversight there, right? There's a judge, there's a jury, there's appeals courts, where on the intelligence side, on the foreign and counterintelligence side, there's no oversight, right? There's this one secret court that nobody ever gets to see what happens there, and that's basically it. They're basically on their own to do what they want. So because of that, when they were setting it up, they wanted to make sure this is used for the limited purpose of gathering foreign intelligence about foreign governments and our interactions with them. But what happened after 9/11, it was, hey, we have this nice power over here where we can do stuff without oversight. Let's use that power more aggressively to gather evidence that we can later use in the other side in criminal courts. So right when I saw that, I knew that was going to be a problem. But Attorney General Ashcroft also started amending the Attorney General guidelines to expand what you could do without reasonable suspicion, right? So before, there used to be a thing called a preliminary inquiry. And what would happen is if somebody called up and said, I think, Mike German, who lives in East Portland and drives a red Mustang, is a drug dealer. Okay, they might, it's an anonymous call, not really quite reasonably suspicious, but let's look in DMV. And sure enough, there's a guy named Mike German who lives in East Portland who drives a red Mustang. All right, we've just verified the 3 pieces of information, so that bolsters the argument. So there was this short period of time, usually it was less than 90 days, that you could do a limited number of things to verify the information for the purpose of determining whether you could investigate them, whether you could gather this reasonable suspicion, right? So what Ashcroft did is he took that 90 days and expanded it into 6 months, and then expanded it into a year with a little bit higher approval. So basically, even though you don't have reasonable suspicion, you can investigate somebody for up to a year, right? Which is a pretty strong power. He also changed the rules so that FBI agents could go to any public meeting and the same terms as the public without identifying themselves. So because this is a public event, an FBI agent could come and sit here and take notes and document who's here without any suspicion that any of us are doing anything wrong. The government was presenting this as necessary to find terrorists. Well, I knew you could find terrorists using reasonable suspicion, so I knew that it wasn't for that this power would be abused to go after the same people the FBI has always suspected: political dissidents, immigrant communities, and communities of color. And when I left the FBI, the first time the ACLU hired me was to look through the JTTF documents that they had obtained through FOIA to help them try to understand what was going on. Unfortunately, the ratchet has continued to turn. So in 2008, in fact, in December of 2008, a month before the Bush administration went out the door and the Obama administration came in, Attorney General Michael McCasey changed the FBI's guidelines again to create a type of investigation called an assessment. And an assessment requires no factual predicate. No factual predicate. They don't need to have any reason to believe you or anybody else has done anything wrong to investigate you. And they can investigate you for recurring 30-day increments just with a local supervisor okaying it. So they can just continue this investigation with no outside time limit. And the types of techniques they can use are overt and covert interviews, which is one of their primary practices now, where, and many activists out there will know this, that before some big event, an FBI agent will knock on your door. And if you won't talk to him at your house, he'll knock on your boss's door. And he'll knock on your landlord's door and ask questions about you, identifying himself as a member of the Joint Terrorism Task Force that, of course, can have implications in your employment and living conditions when the FBI is coming around asking everyone if you're a terrorist. This assessment authority also allows the FBI to investigate you, including not just these overt and covert interviews. They can recruit and task informants. They can use grand jury subpoenas to get telephone records, subscriber records. They can do database searches, not just government databases, but commercial databases. They can also do racial and ethnic mapping. Anybody know about that? The FBI uses census data to map all American communities by race and ethnicity and track what they call ethnic behaviors. When I was still at the ACLU, we did a nationwide FOIA campaign trying to identify these ethnic behaviors, and unfortunately the courts allowed the FBI to keep those secret. They released a lot of the documents that revealed, for instance, in Michigan, there was a document that said because there is a big Middle Eastern population here and there are terrorist groups in the Middle East, we need to map all Middle Eastern communities in Michigan. There was a document out of Georgia that said because there are black separatist groups, we want to track the growth of the black population in Georgia to evaluate the risk of black separatists in Georgia. In San Francisco, there was a memo that said that Chinese Americans have been involved in organized crime in San Francisco, so therefore they would be able to map all Chinese communities in San Francisco. And this is really as broad a campaign of racial profiling as there can be. It's neighborhood racial profiling. We argued at the time that that was broader than the guidelines allowed. So in 2014, the Department of Justice changed the racial profiling guidelines to specifically authorize racial and ethnic mapping by the FBI. And of course, the FBI doesn't draw these pictures just to put them on the wall because they look pretty. When they put a line on a map, they're treating one community differently from the other community based on some line on a map that is entirely based on race and ethnicity. So we feel that these are clear indicators that working with this less than reasonable suspicion opens the door to this kind of abuse. And we think it's incumbent on the City Council in Portland and hopefully your state authorities as well to enforce Oregon law, which requires reasonable suspicion before the police gather information about citizens. And again, this is not a high standard, it's a very low standard. So it shouldn't be any problem. And when the 2011 ordinance passed, it was an opportunity to get some visibility, right? Like I said, this national security stuff, very little public oversight over what's going on. And they resisted it, which in law enforcement we call that a clue. San Francisco actually followed Portland's lead and passed their own ordinance requiring reporting. There they resisted the reporting again, and the City Council and the San Francisco Police Department actually withdrew from the Joint Terrorism Task Force because they were violating the ordinance. Oakland has now passed an ordinance requiring this kind of public reporting, and again, we're anticipating that the JTTF will resist reporting because, typically when somebody is resisting reporting, it's because if they do report, it's worse than if they don't, right? We think at this point it's pretty clear that the JTTF is unwilling to fully comply with this kind of public reporting. So having Portland withdraw is really the best way to protect the people of Portland, the people of Oregon, from this kind of inappropriate spying that doesn't actually keep anybody safer, right? This isn't something that's going to put anybody at risk. Again, reasonable suspicion is a low category. The reason the FBI has federal task forces like the JTTF is that they need help. There are only 13,000 FBI agents across the country and around the world, right? It's not a very big organization. So they are heavily dependent on state and local law enforcement to assist them in all their investigations, right? They have the high-intensity drug trafficking task force. They have violent crimes task forces. They have child pornography task forces because they want to use the state and local resources. And in just doing normal investigations, as an FBI agent, a call would come in and they'd say, Mike German is involved in this activity. Most cases, the first thing I would do is pick up the phone and call a local cop and say, what do you know about Mike German, right? Because the law enforcement officers on the street usually have a better idea of what's going on in the community than a small handful of FBI agents working federal cases. So the idea that the FBI wouldn't work with Portland police if it wasn't in a joint terrorism task force capacity is simply not true. So the FBI will continue to be dependent on state and local law enforcement, even where there isn't a task force. And there are plenty of other task forces where information will go. What not being in the task force will prevent is local police being able to use this big bucket of data that the FBI is gathering about all of us, right? Anybody with a phone, the FBI has been gathering your data for 11 years before Edward Snowden finally told us about it, and that program got limited a little bit. But the FBI has all kinds of collection mechanisms where it gathers these enormous databases of information that has nothing to do with anybody being a criminal, but just information about the public. So that would be accessible to the Portland police officers who are sitting on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So even though they didn't collect the information, they didn't violate the statute, they would have access to information that does violate the statute. So there are good reasons why we don't want the Portland police using that information in a way that would harm the public. One of the questions that we get a lot is whether there is evidence of Joint Terrorism Task Force abuse. And the FOIAs that the ACLU did in the early 2000s showed a tremendous amount of that. And it's interesting because the FOIAs went out in 2004. We got all the information back by 2006 and publicized it. The FBI, Robert Mueller, then the director, went to Congress, and one of the groups was the Thomas Merton Center for Peace and Justice in Pittsburgh. And there was a long memo going through the history of the Thomas Merton Center and describing and having photographs of an anti-war protest they put on. And so the director testified that this is being misunderstood. This was actually because there was an international terrorist who was supposed to be at the protest, and we were monitoring the protest to find this one person that we were looking for, not to monitor the protesters. So Patrick Leahy, senator who was then chairman of the Judiciary Committee, said, "Great, I'd like to be briefed on that investigation." And they said, "Well, that was actually an error. It was part of a different investigation out of Texas that we can show you." So he said, "Okay, let me see that." And then they said, "Okay, there really wasn't an investigation." And Patrick Leahy asked for an inspector general investigation. It wasn't until 2010 that that report got published, and it only looked at a handful of the cases. But what he found was that people were being investigated because agents were speculating that they might commit a crime in the future. And that was all that was necessary, according to the Inspector General, to justify the investigation. An agent speculating that the people they wanted to investigate might commit a crime in the future. And I would argue that everybody in this room might commit a crime in the future, so why was it that they picked these particular political activists? And I would argue that it was because the agents didn't like their advocacy, and that's why they were chosen. Interestingly, the report came out in 2010. Between 2006 and 2010 is when the FBI had changed the rules again. So even as they're getting criticized for spying on protest groups under the 2002 authority, they've actually expanded it before the Inspector General's report comes out. So, it's clear that they are impervious to that kind of outside criticism and are simply interested in expanding their ability to choose who they investigate, not based on any wrongdoing, but based on their idea of who presents a threat based on their activism. And one of the last things that we've seen this summer, you might have read about Foreign Policy did a story on a leaked document describing what they called a movement of black identity extremists, right? And there was a 2-paragraph description of what a black identity extremist was, but basically it was if you were black and you were concerned about police violence, you were a black identity extremist. And the way that the FBI document presented this threat was that it was a direct threat to law enforcement. And they took 6 cases where people who didn't know one another, weren't part of any similar movement, to justify this nationwide movement they called black identity extremism.